I don't know if any of you saw the cover of Newsweek magazine this last week. They had an interesting cover. It had a picture of a man and a woman on the cover, and the headline on the cover was, "She works, he stays home." And this was supposedly the new trend, toward house husbands. This was, they had to write up, this great new thing that somebody's figured out that, why don't the women go out and earn the living and pursue the careers? Just let the men stay home. Well, it's amazing. It's like if people put their minds to coming up with wacky ideas, they couldn't come up with any more than they do. If there's one thing that ought to be pretty self-evident, it's many of the things about men and women and the family unit. And yet we find that when you look at humanity, different civilizations, different cultures, it's like they swing from one extreme to the other. Over in our country, we've gotten so nutty. Back prior to the Iraq War, they showed on the news sometimes there'd be the husband and the kids standing on the dock waving goodbye. The wife was in her military uniform. She was getting on the boat. It's nuts. Just to be frank, it's nuts. It's like the inmates are running the asylum. You look at a cover like this on Newsweek. Back several years ago, Time magazine, they had a little more astute observation. They were reporting on a government state, your taxpayer dollars at work. Their headline on the front cover of Time magazine several years ago, it says, "Men and women, they really are different." Now, do you realize it took a scientific investigation and a lot of tax money for some brilliant fella to come up with that conclusion? Now, I think most everybody that I know figured that out when they were pretty young, that men and women, they really are different. How old were you when you knew? Did you have to, need a government grant and needed to study the subject for several years? But you find all sorts of ideas and all sorts of wacky notions. Now, you can go to the other extreme, and this made quite a bit of news over in this country when you looked at places like Afghanistan and Iran and some of these Islamic republics. Afghanistan was supposedly an Islamic government. They had the women dressed in the equivalent of sort of like a long black sack. And it had a little slit for the eyes, but some of them even had mesh over the slit, so the women could see out, but that was, you couldn't see in, and it was just sort of this black sack. They don't call it a sack, but that's what it looked like to me. And you see over there, and you see some of this, and of course, some of the secular commentators over here, they say, well, see, that's the fundamentalists. And they try to take this particular title, which they would apply to us, because if you take the Bible literally, they want to label you. They say, oh, you're a fundamentalist. And so the concept that many of both the secular leadership as well as the liberal wing of so-called Christianity, their idea is that, well, if you really took the Bible literally, then that's the way you'd have women. Women would be second-class citizens. Women would be relegated to some way down position. And they want to make out every time they hear about something as far as religion, people that want to take the Bible seriously, and they say, oh, you want to oppress women. Well, is that what the Bible teaches? Does the Bible teach that women ought to go around in a black sack and somehow be relegated to some very minor or menial status? What you find is that the world doesn't have a clue. They go to various extremes, come up with various answers, most of which are incorrect. Now, people are quick to have opinions on something. I had a little experience with that this past week. On Monday, I had forwarded to me an email that had arrived at headquarters. My telecast on a biblical tale of two cities was shown this past weekend, and evidently this fellow, who was a very devout Catholic, had seen the program. And on the program, I didn't talk about the Catholic Church on the program, but I advertised the booklet on Who is the Beast. Beast of Revelation. Well, he went to the website, didn't really read the booklet, sort of skimmed through it far enough to find out that we didn't say anything real good about the Catholics. And boy, was he hot. He wrote off his hot email, and he was going to complain to the station and all of these things. And he was mad. He accused us that we were calling the Catholic Church the Beast of Revelation. Well, the note got forwarded to me just for my information, so I thought, well, I want to write to this guy. And my first temptation, it's good not to act on first impulses. My first thought was to tell him, "Oh no, you've got it wrong. We didn't say. I'm sorry. You thought we said the Catholic Church was the Beast of Revelation. The Catholic Church isn't the beast. It's the great whore that rides the beast." Then I thought, I probably shouldn't say that quite that way. I'm going to tell Mr. Meredith. I'm going to say that I told him. If you like the Beast booklet, why don't you read Who is the Antichrist? You'll really like that one. That's Mr. Meredith's booklet. But no, what I actually told him, I wrote him back, and in the course of his email, he made reference to the fact, I don't see how you can dare to say such things about the original church. And that was his phrase. So I wrote him back, and I just said, well, I really appreciate you taking the time to write in response to the program, express your opinions. You made a statement referring to the Catholic Church as the original church. If you really want to find out about the original church, we have another booklet on our website that I'd suggest you download, Restoring Apostolic Christianity. And, if you download it and read it, I think you'll come to the same conclusions I did, and I'd certainly be happy to discuss it with you. Well, we've exchanged emails back and forth a couple of times through the week. And he hadn't really read very much yet. I don't know if he will or not. But anyway, it gave him something to do other than complain to the local station in Omaha. So he may still do that. But, people have opinions. Oh, he thought he was an expert. He knew all about it. He was obviously a young man and a devout Catholic. And he was just amazed. Anybody would say something about the original church. Well, you don't have to read much history to figure out what the Catholic Church is. And the original church, well, you don't have to take my word for it. Just go to the Bible. Go to the New Testament, See if the Catholic Church teaches what you find in the New Testament. People are filled with opinions. And a lot of people who've never read the Bible are sure that they know what the Bible says. People would tell you, depending on what side of the fence they're on, some of these sort of feminist and liberal types. Oh, well, the Bible's really down on women. Paul, he was really down on women. Paul didn't like women. Amazing. You read these statements. Well, what's your proof of that? I'm going to show you that that's absolutely not the case. What the Bible has to say about women is very different than what a lot of people seem to think. The Bible explains that there is structure in the home, and God established that structure. It goes all the way back to creation. And yet, the Bible shows also very clearly that women are not an afterthought. They're not some inferior creature. A lot of pagan concepts have come in over the years, even in first century Judaism. You read in the New Testament, and there's a reference in a couple of places to the court of the women, and it talks about the area of the temple courtyard referred to as the court of the women. Now, if you go back to the instructions in Exodus, where instructions for the tabernacle were given, you go to the details of the building of the temple in Chronicles, you read, and even Jewish sources will admit that there was no separate court of the women until about 200 years before Christ. There's no instructions in the Old Testament, no instructions in terms of the building of the tabernacle if they were to separate off a certain court and not allow the women to go past that. You know where that came from? It came from the Greeks. There were a lot of pagan concepts. The Greeks were very much down on women. In fact, Aristotle, who's supposed to be quite a smart fellow, but when you read some of what he said, you wonder how he got that reputation, because he said some pretty dumb things. His definition of women was that he defined women as deficient men. Now, of course, a lot of other things that Aristotle had wrong. But the academy started by Plato, and Aristotle was one of his students. And Plato, of course, had been a student of Socrates. When you really want to read about it, you find out that the so-called academy in Athens was a hotbed of homosexual activity way back when. And so a lot of the ideas that came into even so-called Western civilization and Catholic teaching didn't come straight out of the Bible. A lot of concepts that the Jews had, even in the time of Christ, a lot of the distinctions they made were not based on what the Bible taught. They were based on what they had absorbed from the pagan society around them. You know, Judea was under Greek domination for a period of the better part of 3 centuries, about certainly a little over 2 centuries. And Greek thought and Greek philosophy and Greek education and Greek attitudes sort of seeped in. And they don't just totally abandon all the outward forms of the Bible, but what they do is absorb in certain pagan concepts, and it all sort of gets stirred up in the pot. You find that the way Christ dealt with women and the relationships that were had in the New Testament church were very, very different from Greek civilization and even from first century Jewish civilization. Because much of first century Judaism had absorbed a lot of pagan concepts during the time of Persian and Greek, particularly Greek domination. Now, you know, the Bible is filled with examples about women. And some people sort of have the idea, well, boy, you know, the Bible says some pretty bad things. You know, it uses women in a pretty bad light. I mean, after all, in Revelation it talks about the great whore who sits astride the beast. And so, you know, here's women mentioned in a very negative context or used to symbolize something very negative. But you know, while the book of Revelation refers to the great false church as being a great whore and uses a very derogatory term for Revelation 17, when you go to Revelation 12, it also describes the true church as a woman, a chaste virgin, a spouse to Christ. Paul used that term in Ephesians. So, the Bible uses women as a symbol of something very good and very pure, and also symbol of something very bad, because women, like men, sort of run the gamut of human nature and behavior, and you've got the good and the bad and the in-between. And the Bible certainly uses that, and there are things that bring out and characterize the best, and there are things that bring out and characterize the worst. So when you look at the book of Revelation, for instance, you find the symbolism of a woman, a chaste woman, a woman who is pure, who is loyal, who is devoted, who is pictured as the virgin bride of Christ. And yet, on the other hand, you have one who is involved in all sorts of immoral intrigue that is also pictured. So, both pictures are given, and really the pictures in Revelation, using women in both a very negative and a very positive context, really didn't originate in the book of Revelation. If you go back to the book of Proverbs, you find that a woman is personified, again, in a very positive way and a very negative way. If you go back to the book of Proverbs, Proverbs starts out, one of the purposes we're told here in Proverbs is to, as it says in Proverbs chapter 2, one of the purposes of Proverbs, it's written as though it's instructions from a father to his son, Proverbs 2:16, to deliver you from the strange woman, the stranger that flatters with her words, who forsakes the guide of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. So it uses the symbolism of an immoral woman, an adulteress, a fornicator, one who is involved in the wrong kind of behavior, the harlot, as it were. And so you read through this section of Proverbs, and this theme keeps recurring. Talks about in Proverbs 6:26, by means of a whorish woman, a man is brought to a piece of bread. You know, what he's saying, in effect, is, son, you get tangled up with the wrong kind of woman, and it will wreck your life. It'll bankrupt you. It'll ruin you. You'll be doing good to eat by the time all is over with. And, you know, a lot of people have found that out right on down to our society. There's a lot of country and western songs about that, you know, that the fella, I don't listen to it, and so I can't recite all very many of the words, but if you do listen to it, you know what I mean. You don't have to go very far. You can just catch one every now and then, and you find these descriptions. You know, what's the one? All my exes live in Texas, and you see all this thing. You know, it's the same thing. It's as old as the Book of Proverbs. But you know, while the Book of Proverbs personifies a woman in this way of a wicked woman, a whorish woman, a harlot, an immoral woman, you realize the Book of Proverbs also personifies wisdom as a woman. In Proverbs 1:20, it says, wisdom cries without. She utters her voice in the streets. She cries in the chief place of the concourse. You know, and it goes through, and there are many places here as you come through this section all the way up through chapter 9 that personify wisdom as a woman. And let's just notice Proverbs 7, verse 4. Say unto wisdom, you are my sister. Call understanding your kinswoman. Proverbs chapter 8, verse 1, does not wisdom cry, and understanding put forth her voice? She stands in the top of the high places, by the way of the places of the paths. She cries at the gates, and at the entry of the city, at the coming in of the doors. Chapter 9, verse 1, wisdom has builded her house. She's hewn out her 7 pillars, and talks about wisdom having, sort of described wisdom holding a banquet here. Wisdom is personified as a woman. So just like the Bible uses a woman to personify some very wrong things and describes the seduction of the harlot and the devastation that can produce, on the other hand, wisdom is personified as a woman. In fact, it's interesting, some of you, I don't believe we have any Sophies here, but you know, the Greek word for wisdom is Sophia. That's where that name comes from, and it's actually became popular as a name derived from the Greek version of Proverbs, because it was the term that is used here. So the Bible uses women in a very positive context. It also uses and describes women in a negative context in terms of negative behavior, because as you look through the Bible, you find there are many examples. You know, some focus in on the fact, well, you know, the Bible talks about Eve and how she was beguiled. Well, that's right. She was beguiled. She was naive. The Bible says that she was deceived. It also says that Adam wasn't. Now, does that really speak well of Adam? He knew better, but he didn't do better. And Eve, what the devil said sounded plausible to her. Well, God expected Adam to lead, and he didn't. He showed weakness and went along with his wife, and so he didn't do what he should have done. That reflected pretty poorly on him for not having stood up and provided the leadership in the right way that he should have in his household. But you know, the Bible also contains many, many positive examples when you look at women. It talks about Sarah, and Sarah is pictured as a partner in faith with Abraham. It wasn't just that Abraham had faith and he sort of dragged Sarah along. The example that you read in the book of Genesis is Sarah's example of faith. And that stood out to the point that Peter, later on in the book of 1 Peter, described Sarah as an example for Christian women, and he said, whose daughters you are, as long as you do well. So Peter held Sarah up as an example and told Christian women that you are accounted daughters of Sarah. if you follow Sarah's example. And Sarah's example, the example that Peter stresses, was the fact that Sarah looked beyond her husband to see God. Sarah's faith was in God. Now, Sarah had lapses. She didn't have perfect faith. Abraham didn't either. But Sarah is certainly pictured in the Scriptures as an outstanding example of faith. She was a partner in faith with Abraham. You could go on and look at many, many other positive examples. You know, we have a couple of books in the Old Testament that take their names from women whose stories are recounted. There's the book of Ruth. You know, Ruth is held up as an example of loyalty and devotion. Ruth's loyalty and devotion was certainly to the family, to her mother-in-law, but it was beyond that. You see, the source of Ruth's loyalty and devotion to her mother-in-law was because Ruth had come to trust in the God of Israel. She grew up in an environment that was as absolutely pagan as you can get. You go back and you read the story of the Moabites, that's what Ruth was, the Moabites and the Ammonites. Now, the Moabites and the Ammonites were the descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. So they were, from an ethnic standpoint, very similar people to the Israelites, but they had long since degenerated in their religion. And you read about the Moabites and their worship of Chemosh, this great big leering idol that they literally burned little babies to, and as sacrifices, and just every sort of horrible thing that you can imagine that was practiced as the pagan religion of that society. Now, you remember the story, of course, that Naomi and her husband Elimelech had, at a time of famine during the days of the Judges, had left Judea, left the area of Bethlehem, and had gone over to Moab because evidently crops were doing better over there. And so they went over there, but one problem followed after another problem, and after a period of several years, Elimelech was dead, the two sons were dead, and all that was left was the widowed Naomi and her two widowed daughters-in-law. Well, Naomi, as you can imagine, was just absolutely heartsick. She had lost everything. She lost her husband, lost her sons, and was here in a strange country, and she had heard that weather had improved and rain was coming and crops were growing again, and what she wanted to do was go back home. Well, her daughters-in-law said, well, look, we'll go with you. Ruth and Orpah were the two daughters-in-law, and Naomi figured, you know, you don't really want to come back. I mean, you think you do at the moment, you're emotionally upset, but you're going to get back over here and you're going to be in a different country, you're going to be around different people. I can't look after you. I can't provide for you. I don't know how I'm going to provide for myself. And the best thing for you girls to do, I really appreciate your kindness to me, your kindness to my sons, but the best thing for you to do is going back home to your family, and you're young, you'll get married again, you'll have a family, and life will go on. Well, they first both said they didn't want to do that, and then Orpah said, okay. So she said goodbye and went on back, and Ruth told her mother-in-law, she says, no, I'm going to go with you. Now, why did she say that? She said, your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. You know, Naomi had told her, she said, well, now, why don't you go back like your sister-in-law? Go back to your people. Go back to your gods. Because Naomi realized that when the girls got back home, they would fall right back into the same old practices that they had grown up with. You see, she thought that their convictions were shallow. They practiced the religion of Israel, but that was just because they married somebody and sort of took on the religion of their husbands. That's the way Naomi assumed the situation to be. And in Orpah's case, perhaps that was true. But with Ruth, it went deeper. And it's interesting what Boaz said to her, and Mr. Harmdurk's alluded in the sermonette. There's certainly the analogy of Ruth and Boaz and the church and Christ, and that certainly follows through. But let me just make one other point here in Ruth, rather than getting off into some of that as we have, and I think I have in sermons around Pentecost in times past. But when Boaz encountered Ruth, he said in Ruth 2, verse 12, Boaz comment to Ruth. He said, "The Lord recompense your work, and a full reward be given you of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you are come to trust." What he recognized in Ruth's example is that Ruth had come to trust, to put her trust and her confidence in the God of Israel. Under His protection, she had come to trust. So, Ruth is singled out as an example of loyalty and devotion. And a very outstanding example as her life is given here in the book of Ruth. You go on a little later in the New Testament, you come to Esther. Now, Esther really stands out as an example of courage. She, of course, you remember the story, a young girl, during the time when the Persian Empire ruled the Jews, and the king of Persia had had a falling out with his queen. He was not a particularly outstanding fellow in any sort of positive way. If you read the beginning of the book of Esther, you know, it tells us that, well, in fact, I'll just call your attention here to the opening verse. Talks about this big banquet that the king of Persia had here in Esther chapter 1. And it uses the term that he made a feast, Esther chapter 1, verse 5. He made a feast unto all the people present. Well, if you look up the literal Hebrew, it wasn't so much feast in the sense of eating. The king made a drinking unto all the people. And that's the emphasis of it. Verse 7, they gave them drink in vessels of gold. And verse 8, the drinking was according to the law, none did compel. In other words, they weren't just all drinking in unison. They just kept pouring, and everybody was drinking as they wanted. So it wasn't long before most of them were probably sloshed. Verse 10, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. He was really he was really loaded by that time. That describes this big blow up that they had, and so now he's going to show who's in charge. You know, his buddies tell him, "Yeah, you need to let everybody know who's in charge." And so he's going to let everybody know who's in charge, and he gets rid of the old queen. He's going to find a new queen. Wouldn't you like to be? This is not queen for a day. See, this is you're going to be stuck for the rest of your life. Wouldn't you like to be recruited? You know, it wasn't the king went out and said, "Would you like to be my queen?" No. You know, what they did was he appointed officers to gather together all these young girls. They just went out, and if they saw one that looked likely, "Come on, you know, you're coming here." So they got this big group together and brought them all there, and then the king could sort of go through them one at a time and take his pick. What a mess. Here's poor Esther caught in the middle of that. Well, you know how the story unfolds as you go on along. We come up with Haman, who was a wicked sort, and who really had it in for the Jews, and wanted to eliminate them all, and gets the king to sign this decree, to eliminate all the Jews. I mean, how would you like to deal with a guy like this? I mean, just on the whim, he's ready to sign a decree, kill everybody. A fellow like this was fairly easily manipulated and was a capricious sort of guy. Well, Mordecai found out, of course, what was going to happen, and he got word to his cousin Esther. And he said, maybe God's put you in that place at this time. You need to go into the king and seek deliverance for our people. Now, the easy thing for Esther would have been to say, "Hey, I don't want to get involved." That was really the first thought that came to her mind. It's dangerous. You don't just walk into the king. Even though I'm the queen, I can't just walk into the king. You walk into the king, and if he's not feeling in a good mood and holds out his scepter, there's a guy standing there with a sword to just lop your head off. Now, you've heard sometimes of certain people, maybe you've made the comment about somebody, Oh, he just bit my head off. Well, you don't mean it literally. In Esther's case, it could have been literal. So she told Mordecai, she said, well, I'll tell you what. I will go in. I'll put my life on the line. But you tell all the Jews in Shushan, you got them all together, and all of you fast for the next 3 days. I'm going to fast for the next 3 days, and then I'm going to walk into the king. Now, how would you like to have to fast for 3 days in order to get your courage up to walk in to see your husband? That's not the makings of a happy situation. But you know, it was the situation where she found herself, and she evidenced courage and faith in God. And God used her to deliver her people from the enemies of the Jews, and also to eliminate Haman and some of that group. The point is, God uses women as outstanding examples of faith and loyalty and courage. You go to the New Testament, you find similar things. Notice back here in Acts chapter 16. Paul and Silas have been traveling across Asia Minor, across the area of Galatia, and that's described in Acts chapter 16. And they come on to the very coast, the western coast of Asia Minor, which is, let's say, the very western coast of Turkey as it's facing toward Greece. And they were in a little port city called Troas. And Paul had in mind certain things of where he was going to go and what he was going to do. But when he went to sleep that night, he had a dream, and it was very vivid. And in the dream, he saw a man from Macedonia. And the man in Macedonia said, come over and help us. Paul woke up the next morning and he knew for sure where God wanted him to go, so he changed his plans. They caught a boat, crossed from Asia Minor into Europe. This was the beginning of the gospel going into Europe. They crossed into Greece and went up northern Greece, Macedonia, went to Philippi, which was the capital, chief city of Macedonia. And they got there in verse 13 of Acts 16. On the Sabbath, we went out of the city by a riverside, where prayer was wont to be made. And we sat down and spoke unto the women which resorted there. There's evidently not enough Jews for a synagogue in Philippi. There were a few people, and the only ones that it mentions gathering there were women. Paul went out there and he spoke to these women. And a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, who worshipped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things that were spoken by Paul. And when she was baptized in her household, she besought us, saying, if you judge me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us. There was a woman, we're not told exactly her circumstance. Perhaps she was widowed, but she was evidently, there's no mention of her husband here. Whatever the circumstance, she was having to support herself, was evidently a wealthy woman, because we find later that it was actually her home, which was large enough that the church met there in her home. She had a household, had family members, probably servants, that were part of her household. But here was the very first person in Europe that was baptized. The very first convert was a woman. Now, if you go on down through the story, that she, of course, wanted to help, wanted to serve in the work, wanted that Paul and Silas and Timothy and whoever they had with them, that they would just come and have her hospitality. Well, a little later, another woman comes into the play, this time a young woman, young girl, who was possessed by a demon. And she was a slave girl, and her masters were getting rich off of her fortune telling. Well, they had a real gold mine, they thought. Paul saw her, and he felt sorry for the girl and cast the demon out, put those guys out of the fortune telling business. And when they saw that their hope of gain was gone, that's what they were looking for. They were making money hand over fist on this poor girl who was they were using to tell fortunes. And so now, when they saw that she couldn't tell fortunes anymore, they were upset. Boy, they wanted Paul and Silas thrown into jail. And they were. And they were beaten up. And God, of course, intervened. He sent an earthquake that evening as Paul and Silas had been thrown in jail. And the jailer, poor jailer, was about to commit suicide because the earthquake was so violent it threw all the doors in the prison open. And the jailer just knew all the prisoners had escaped, and he was going to be held responsible for the whole thing. He was just ready to commit suicide, and Paul stopped him and said, "Why, we're all here." Well, you go on through the story, and ultimately the jailer himself was baptized. Then the next day, the magistrates had sort of sent word, we'll let these fellows go. We've taught them a lesson. And Paul said, "Oh, no, you don't. We have been beaten openly. We were not condemned according to the law. We are Roman citizens. What you magistrates did is serious business. You're not just going to dismiss us and expect that we're going to slink out like an old dog with his tail between the legs. You come down here and get us." And the magistrates showed up down there, and they were very apologetic because, if there was one thing a magistrate could get in trouble with, it was messing with a Roman citizen if you didn't follow the rules. Life has not changed a whole lot. You can do things to non-citizens you can't do to citizens. A lot of non-citizens we caught over in Afghanistan, we shipped them to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Why did we put them there? Well, number one, there's no place to escape to them, and you can go to Castro's Cuba. That'd be a wonderful haven. You could swim 90 miles to Florida. That doesn't sound like a good option. So you can't get away. And all the lawyers and the federal judges in the United States, none of them can get down there. Absolutely off limits. Now, you couldn't do that to a citizen. You remember this boy from out in Northern California that John Walker Lind, they called him over there, and they couldn't put him in Guantanamo Bay. They had to bring him back to the United States. He was a citizen. So he had rights. These other guys that are not citizens, they didn't have any rights other than what we chose to give them. Life really has not changed a whole lot in 2,000 years. Citizens, by virtue of citizenship, have certain rights. Non-citizens don't have those same rights. That's that's just the way it is. So Paul was a Roman citizen. These magistrates had jumped the gun. They hadn't thought about that. So now they come down and they're trying to smooth it over, and they don't want to get in trouble. And we're told the magistrates feared, verse 38, when they heard they were Romans. So they came and besought them. They were very nice. Would you please leave? So verse 40, when they came out of the prison, they entered into the house of Lydia. And when they had seen the brethren, they comforted them and departed. So here by this time, the whole little church there in Philippi was meeting in Lydia's home. Evidently, she must have had a nice-sized home, but it was a little group there in Philippi. Probably no more than what we've got here in this room. They were meeting there in this wealthy woman's home. But she was certainly an outstanding example, the very first person to be converted in that area. When you get to the book of Romans in chapter 16, Paul has gone through many different topics in Romans, but when he gets to chapter 16, he sort of closes with a lot of personal references. Romans chapter 16, verse 1, he says, writing here, and Paul is writing from Corinth, which is where he is, and he's writing to the church in Rome. And he said, I commend unto you Phoebe, our sister, which is a servant or a deaconess, and that's what the word literally is in the Greek, which is a deaconess of the church which is at Cenchrea. Cenchrea was the port of Corinth. The Corinthian church actually met in Cenchrea. And so he is writing to the church at Rome. He says, I want to commend to you Phoebe, our sister. She's a deaconess here in Corinth. I want you to receive her in the Lord as becomes saints. Assist her in whatever business she has need of. For she has been a succorer of many. She's helped a lot of people. She's helped me also. So he said, I want you to help her. She's going there to Rome, whatever reason she had to go or why she needed to go and whatever business she had. Here she is going to a strange city, coming a long ways. Paul evidently sent the book of Romans along with her. And so he mentioned her here at the end. He told the church at Rome, I want you to help her out. Look out for her. She's an outstanding person. She really serves the brethren here in Corinth and she's helped a lot of people. She's helped me. So you extend to her whatever help she needs. Now greet Priscilla and Aquila, my helpers in the Lord, who have for my life laid down their own necks, unto whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Likewise greet the church that is in their home, in their house. Priscilla and Aquila. Now Priscilla and Aquila were a husband and wife team. Aquila and his wife Priscilla. And Paul had encountered them. They were Jews from Rome, had been expelled in the early 50s when Claudius issued this decree and kicked all the Jews out, and they had fled Rome and gone to Corinth, and that's where Paul met them, and he had become acquainted with them and spent time with them, and now they were back in Rome, and the church in Rome met in Priscilla and Aquila's house. But it wasn't just a one-sided thing. It wasn't, well, Aquila's in the church, he's really an outstanding leader, and Priscilla sort of comes along. No, she's mentioned right along with her husband. They evidently helped and served a lot of people. In fact, Paul said they put their own necks on the line for me. They have for my life laid down their own neck. They have really been an outstanding example of courage and faithfulness. They've helped a lot of people. They've helped me. The church there in Rome meets in their house. And so Paul sends greetings to that group. He goes on and salutes different ones. In verse 6 he says, Greet Mary, who bestowed much labor upon us. Salute Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen, and my fellow prisoners, who are of note before the apostles, among the apostles who were also in Christ before me. Andronicus and Junia, again, that's man and woman, the undoubtedly husband and wife, who were related to Paul, one or the other, probably a cousin of Paul's, and they were in the church before he was. Very dedicated. Paul sends greetings to them. They're there in Rome. He goes on and salutes various others that he mentions. Verse 13, he says, Salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. So Rufus' mother was evidently just like a mother to Paul. She was a fine lady and was a motherly person and someone that had taken Paul under her wing and encouraged him, and he felt very close to her. He goes on and mentions others in verse 15. Salute Philologus and Julia, Nereus and his sister, and Olympus and all the saints which are with them. So Paul gives a lot of greetings here in this book of Romans, singles out a number of people, many of whom are women. Dedicated members of the church, dedicated members of the congregation, people that Paul loved and respected, people who had set an outstanding example. The point being that when you look at the New Testament, you find from the very beginning that there were women that were disciples of Christ. Christ didn't have just 12 disciples. He had 12 apostles that he ordained. He didn't send the women out to preach, and he didn't ordain them to be evangelists or to pastor churches. But, when you go back to John 19, and you find Jesus taken out to be crucified, and he's up there hanging on this stake with his life ebbing away. The soldiers are down there at the bottom, and they're dividing up his clothes and gambling over what's left. Notice here in John 19:25, there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciples standing by whom he loved, he said unto his mother, Woman, behold your son. He said unto the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour that disciple took her unto his own home. It's very interesting. One of the very last things, physical details that Jesus paid attention to was making sure that his mother was taken care of after his death. Well, Joseph undoubtedly was dead prior to his ministry. As you read the New Testament references, the gospel accounts, that seems to be the case. But, here were those who were faithful. You see, in the closing part of the sermon, I want to focus our attention on some very valuable contributions that a godly woman can make. The Bible shows they're not only women used through the Scriptures as outstanding examples, but the world values the wrong thing. The world places value on the wrong thing. It attaches value based on the outward physical things, what size paycheck do you bring home? What kind of car do you drive? What kind of clothes do you have? What do you look like on the outside? No, this is the basis of value. Well, the Bible attaches value based on some very different qualities. And there are some very important, very valuable contributions that a woman can make, far more valuable than bringing home a big paycheck so her husband can stay home and be a house husband. I think one of the outstanding examples that goes through Scripture, and a very outstanding quality that a woman can give her family is loyalty. Loyalty. Here, loyalty not only to the family, loyalty first and foremost to God. And based upon that loyalty to God, loyalty to the family. You read here in John chapter 19, here were disciples, here were these women, and when everybody else had scattered and all the rest of them were hidden and nobody was quite sure what to do, well, the women didn't quite know what to do, but they were there. And they were there right till the end. It was the women who were going to go out to finish preparing the body. Interestingly enough, the very first person to whom Jesus appeared after his resurrection was a woman. He appeared to Mary Magdalene, and he appeared to several of the other women before he appeared to any of the 12. There are undoubtedly reasons for some of these things. We see these women standing there. Peter explains back in 1 Peter chapter 1 or chapter 3. He explained about the impact of a godly woman's example. Sometimes a woman is married to a husband that does not believe the same way. He's not concerned about what the Bible says. 1 Peter 3:1, likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they may without the word be won by the conduct of the wives, while they behold your chaste conduct, coupled with fear, with reverence. You're setting an example that is pure and that shows godly reverence. Whose adorning is not something that primarily comes from the outside. A Christian woman, the most important thing that she has on is not what she puts on the outside, but what shines forth from the inside. The ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. After this manner, in the old time, the holy women also who trusted in God. Holy women who trusted in God. This is how they adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, showing him respect. Whose daughters you are, as long as you do well and are not overcome by your fears. One of the things that gets in the way of people obeying God, certainly gets in the way of women obeying God in terms of the home. You see, our fears can get in the way. We get to looking at the around and we get scared. Yeah, but if I do this, something might happen. I'll make myself vulnerable. And so Peter holds up Sarah's example and said, you follow that example, you'll be accounted as her daughters. Here's an example of loyalty to God. You see, here women who are married, in the earlier case up in verse 1, he mentions women married to husbands that are unbelievers. Did he say, well, put your husband first and forget about the Bible? No, he said, well, they may without the Word. You can't, don't try to club them over the head with the Bible, but set an example for them. Be loyal to God. Put God first. But set the right kind of example, and you never know, sometimes that will have an impact. Our example has far more impact than our words do. You can go around and tell everybody what a good person you are and how religious you are and what a Christian you are. A lot of you maybe work with somebody on your job that way. They're always wanting to get somebody cornered and preach. Argue religion with them. Most folks, they see this guy coming and they're looking for somewhere else to go. But I'll tell you what, you don't have to advertise it by, if you got to go around and keep telling everybody, I'm a real Christian, I'm a real Christian, look at me, I'm a lot better Christian than everybody else. If you've got to go around and tell everybody that, then obviously if they can't figure it out for themselves, then you're probably not setting much an example. But if you just simply set an example, the way you live, the way you treat people, the way you do your job, the way you interact, they will notice things about you that are different. They will respect you far more for the way you live and the things you do than for going around trying to cram something down their throat and tell them, in effect, I'm better than you are. Loyalty is singled out. Notice back in Proverbs 31. Verse 10 talks about the virtuous woman. Who can find a virtuous woman? Her price is far above rubies. Notice why. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. Her husband safely trusts in her. Why? Because she's loyal. She's not going to ever seek to embarrass or humiliate or hurt him or put him down. She'll do him good and not evil all the days of her life. Her loyalty stands out. That's the first quality that's mentioned. And the trust that is a result of that kind of loyalty. It reflects itself in the things she does. She makes sure that her family's provided with good clothing, verse 13. Appropriate clothing. She looks after their diet, verse 14. Make sure that they're properly fed. She's not lazy. She gets up early and makes sure that everything is taken care of, that the family will be taken care of that day. So she's loyal to God, loyal to her husband, and that comes out as a quality that is far beyond price. Can't put a price tag on that sort of thing. In Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 4, it says, a virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. She that makes ashamed is like rottenness to the bones. She can either, by her example and by her conduct, be something that is a wonderful attribute or something that will eat away at the very vitals. Proverbs chapter 18, right on the same theme. Proverbs 18:22 says, whosoever finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor of the Lord. On down a little further in chapter 19, verse 14, it says, house and riches are the inheritance of fathers, and a prudent wife is from the Lord. Your parents can leave you property, they can leave you a house, they can leave you money in the bank. You can inherit physical things. You can inherit a material prosperity from your parents. But no matter how much they love you, they can't give you a really good wife. A good wife is a gift from God. God's the one who provided that gift. And again, singled out here that the role that a good wife can play. Proverbs 14 and verse 1 says, every wise woman builds her house, but the foolish plucks it down with her hands. A woman, by her example, can do very much to build up or to tear down a home. Family life can be built up or torn down by the wisdom or the folly of the mother. A very important role. You can look through many examples that we find in the Scriptures, and we've already talked about several of them. But the gift of loyalty and devotion, first and foremost to God and secondarily to the family, is a vital gift. A vital gift. Now, in addition to loyalty that a woman can give her family, there is also guidance. Guidance. In the book of Titus, chapter 2, well, let's notice first in 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul is here discussing about women, and he's talking about widows and taking care of those that are older. And his recommendation for younger widows is that they're young, they can get remarried and have a family. And notice how he phrased that in 1 Timothy 5:14. He said, I will, therefore, that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house. Give none occasion of the adversary to speak reproachfully. So, it was not only that they would marry, not only that they would have children, but in that context, they would guide the house. They'd provide guidance. They'd provide help. Certainly in the context of guiding the household, taking care of, let's say, the health of the family by nutritious meals, taking care of teaching and guiding the children, instructing them. There's no greater role than can be played by a mother who actively seeks that role and actively works to teach and train her children. Proverbs discusses that back in Proverbs chapter 31, for instance. We have an example right at the very beginning. Here's the way one mother guided her family, guided her children. Proverbs 31, verse 1, the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. So this is what his mother taught him as he was a little kid growing up. He was going to be king someday. Now, what is a mother going to teach her son? Her son is going to grow up and be king. He's going to have wealth. He's going to have power and position. He's going to have a lot of things at his beck and call. Now, you know, great wealth and great power, that's what people think they would like. Oh, that'd be great. I had a lot of money. I had a lot of all these things. But you know, wealth and power is a potential pitfall. It is the undoing of a lot of people because they've got the wealth and the position and the power, and people cater to them and they indulge their whims and they get themselves in trouble. So what did she teach him? What, my son, verse 2, and the son of my womb, what the son of my vows, give not your strength unto women, nor your ways to that which destroys kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it's not for kings to drink wine, or for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Two things she really warned her son about. She says, son, don't get involved in immorality. Don't give your strength unto women. Don't waste your energy, your life pursuing after wine, women, and song. You know, don't be a party animal. Don't be pursuing the wrong kind of women, getting involved in immoral conduct, because it'll wreck your life, son. And don't get involved in abusing alcohol, because, you know, you're going to be in a position of making judgments and making decisions. And if you're out there boozing it up, you're certainly going to pervert judgment. You're not going to be worried about people and their problems and making the right decision. You're going to be looking for having fun, having a party. And your duties are going to not be properly attended to. So here was a mother who gave guidance to her son. She guided him in paths of morality. She taught him the things to do and gave him certain guidance and certain teaching that he remembered and that he recorded. Notice as we look on down, notice on down later in Proverbs 31, down in verse 26. Speaking of the virtuous woman, it says, she opens her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looks well to the ways of her household and eats not the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, or make her happy. That's another translation. Her husband also, and he praises her. So here's someone, she opens her mouth with wisdom. Now, you know, one of the big deals in Afghanistan was the fact that after the Americans took over, they allowed women to go back to school. And I noticed some of the liberal columnists sort of insinuated that if what they sort of labeled as these Bible-thumping fundamentalists could take over in America, they'd probably shut down all the schools for women. Well, that's nuts, at least if you're going to go by the Bible. Here was a woman who is described, she opens her mouth with wisdom. Does that sound like God was against women being educated or learning anything? Here was a woman, the virtuous woman, who certainly was a source of kindness and a source of wisdom. She was somebody to be very helpful in her family. She was a counselor to her husband and a teacher to her children. And she's looking well to the ways of her household. Notice all the way back in Proverbs chapter 1. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8. My son, hear the instruction of your father, and forsake not the law of your mother. There will be an ornament of grace about your head, and chains about your neck. Don't forsake the law of your mother. This presupposes that the mother is going to be teaching and guiding and helping her children to learn right from wrong, teaching them God's ways. She's going to be offering guidance. You know, when you look at the life of Timothy, for instance, you look at a young man, he's introduced to us in Acts chapter 16, and Timothy's mother and grandmother were the ones who had played the formative role in Timothy's young life. And talks about in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, Paul writes to Timothy and he says, when I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith, the unpretended, sincere faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm also persuaded in you. Now you go back to Acts chapter 16, and one of the points that it makes is that Timothy's father was a Greek and his mother was a Jew. Now, his mother had clearly made a mistake of marrying outside the Jewish community, and she got the consequences of that because Acts 16 makes plain that Timothy's father was not a God-fearing Jew. In fact, the specific point is made in Acts 16 that Timothy was uncircumcised. Now, do you realize the implications of that at the first century? In the Jewish community, according to Exodus 12, the only men who could participate in the Old Testament Passover were those who had been circumcised. If you were uncircumcised, you could not participate in the most important ceremony of the Jewish year. Timothy's father clearly didn't want Timothy growing up with all that Jewish stuff. So he had never allowed the boy to be circumcised, which meant that Timothy had never taken part in the Old Testament Passover, which was the central, most important ceremony of every Jewish home, and is still to this day. In fact, it was such an issue in the Jewish community, and Timothy was part Jewish, his mother was Jewish, that Paul had Timothy circumcised when he took him with him, so that it would be evident that Timothy identified with the Jewish community and not the pagan Greek community. So, without being given a bunch of details, it's pretty obvious that there must have been a little bit of tension in the household as young Timothy was growing up. Certainly his parents were divided in terms of religion. But his mother and his grandmother set an example. And Timothy was an outstanding example. Paul took him with him as a teenager, trained him for the ministry, used him in the ministry, regarded him like a son. Paul appreciated the sincerity and the dedication that Timothy had, and he makes comment. Paul had known his mother and grandmother, who perhaps one or both were dead by this time. This is right at the end of Paul's life. But he reminds Timothy, he says, I really appreciate that quality of really sincere, devoted faith that you have. And I remember your mother and I remember your grandmother, and they were an outstanding example of that. I know they had that, and I'm persuaded you do as well. It's possible for a mother or a grandmother to make a very major impact in the life of a child. Now, there are a lot of factors that come in, but clearly in Timothy's life, the positive contribution from a moral and a spiritual standpoint, the only source of right moral and spiritual guidance that Timothy ever got on up until he was about grown was from the two main women in his life, his mother and his grandmother. Paul wrote to Titus, recorded in Titus chapter 2, and he stressed this role also, the guidance. You see, there's guidance in the sense that a woman should be a trusted advisor and counselor to her husband. That doesn't mean that he ought to abdicate his role and just do whatever she says. But it means that he ought to listen to what she says, and a wise and godly woman will be an example. It talks about the law of kindness is in her mouth. It talks about wisdom that comes forth. Her husband listens. He gives thought to what she says. She's there to help him and to counsel him. She's also there to guide and teach the children and to help them grow up in a proper way. And older women can have a big impact on the lives of younger women. Paul told Titus in Titus chapter 2, verse 3, the older women also, this is what you're to teach, Titus, this is what he said, you teach the older women to be in behavior as becomes holiness, to set an example of reverence for God in their lives. Not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they may teach the young women. Now, obviously, the biggest impact the older women have on the young women is by their example. You certainly can't teach someone to do things that you're not doing, but to teach the young women, teach them to be sober, sound-minded, to use good judgment, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet. That would involve everything from modest behavior, teach them to be discreet, chaste. It has to do with purity. It has to do with modesty. It has to do with the way you dress and the way you present yourself. Keepers at home. Good. Obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. God intends a proper feminine role. And there are plenty of instructions in the Scripture. Paul includes a number talking about everything from hair length in 1 Corinthians 11, and how a woman is to wear her hair long as a sign of submission to God and her husband. He talks about here in 1 Timothy and also elsewhere about wearing modest clothing and setting an example that way. The very opposite of the attire of the harlot, but something that reflects a modesty and a purity of spirit and the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, as the phrase is used. So there's guidance to be given in proper feminine values. The older women helping the younger women to appreciate and to value the feminine role and to value what that is in the home and with the husband and with the children. Setting an example, serving as a model of things that they have learned in their life and being able to pass on help and advice and showing by the things they've learned how to better love your family. So we read certainly the role of the value of loyalty, the value of guidance, and don't ever underestimate one more quality. Let's close up on a quality that is the one that God defines as the greatest of virtues, and that is love. Titus 2:4, we just read, says one of the things the older women are to teach the younger women is to love their husbands and to love their children. You know, Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy, he said, one of the characteristics of the end time, the latter days, in the last days, perilous times will come. Men will be lovers of their own selves. Now, that's men in the generic sense. Doesn't just mean males will be in love with themselves and women won't be. Human beings will be lovers of their own selves, absolutely self-focused, selfish, self-centered. He goes on and he mentions another quality. He says, without natural affection. Now, you may come up with various things that would certainly fit the description of natural affection, but I'll tell you, when I read that verse, I don't know of any more natural affection that exists than the love of a mother for her children. That's natural. You find that even in the animal realm. You know, it's natural for a mother animal, mother bird or a mother cat or a mother dog to look after her young, to want to feed them, to nurture them, take care of them, fight somebody that comes to hurt them or intrude on them. We live in a society that throws away millions of babies, aborts them, flushes them away. Horrible. Without natural affection. You know, if there's anybody that ought to be protective of and cherish her child, it's the mother. Now, certainly, father ought to as well. But when you look at that quality and you look at what literally has multiplied itself millions of times over, that is a major sin of our society. A major sin. Mothers murdering their children. That's what it is. And they're going to come before the judgment bar of God for the consequence of something that serious. Without natural affection. Well, the opposite of that, what ought to be there, what is the natural component, is to love, to cherish, to want to take care of, to nurture, to provide, to feed. All of the positive things and the good things. You know, God designed that. That's natural. The mother's body is the place where that child grows. The mother's body is the source of that child's meals, that child's first food. God designed it that way. God could have designed it some other way. He designed it that way. Little human being, little human child arrives helpless. And the mother holds it and nurtures it and takes care of it and feeds it from herself. That love, that bond that is there, that's natural. Natural affection. So the role of a woman. In fact, you know it's interesting. It was his knowledge of a mother's love that established Solomon's reputation for wisdom. You ever think about it that way? Solomon was probably in his teens, late teens maybe, when he took the throne of Israel. If you go through and put the chronology together, it's not. I don't know that you can prove it to the year, but clearly he was young. I think probably maybe around 16, perhaps 17, somewhere in that age group when he became king. That's a young man. Everybody's sort of questioning, boy, we got this kid, he's king. I wonder how things are going to fare. Well, very early on, God came to Solomon in a vision, in a dream, and he offered to give Solomon a gift. And Solomon said, I'm young, and I've got a great nation to rule. Please give me wisdom. Give me the wisdom to guide and to govern this nation. God gave him that gift. The very first incident that we have record of, recorded there in, in 1 Kings, I think, chapter 3. An incident came up. Two women who lived together in the same house, both had babies within a few days of each other, and one of them, in one case, the child died. The woman evidently rolled over on it or smothered it or something during the night, and so she gets the bright idea. She switches children. She puts the dead baby in the other woman's arms. The other woman is asleep, and she takes the live baby. Well, the woman wakes up. The other woman wakes up, and she knows this dead baby's not hers. Now you got two women that are upset, and they're both claiming the baby. And nobody knows what to do with it, and so the next thing you know, it's come to the king. You can just imagine, here's the king, young king, first major audience that he's holding, and we've got a problem. And so here these two women come in, they're all upset with one another, little babies there, and they're both claiming that they're the mother. And here's this young king. What in the world, how do you sort out a problem like that? And all the older folks that were standing around must have wondered, boy, how in the world is he going to handle this? Solomon listened to the two women, and then he said, okay, told some big burly soldier over there with his sword, he said, you get your sword out, take that baby, just divide him in half. We'll give each woman half. Well, immediately, the real mother began to say, oh no, she got upset, oh please don't do that, just go ahead and give the baby to her. Solomon said, I know who the real mother is. Very obvious. Very obvious who has the love of a mother. Give that baby to her. Well, everybody's standing around, their mouth sort of dropped open. They were amazed. Here's this boy. He's come up with this solution. They never thought of that. Solomon's reputation for wisdom began to spread. But it's interesting. His reputation for wisdom rested on his knowledge of a mother's love. Things that he learned. And you go through some of these things, you go through some of the lessons and things that he records in the book of Proverbs, and you have to get back to the fact that much of it went back to things that he learned from his mother. Lessons that were driven home to him, things that he knew and that he understood. When you look at it from God's perspective, you find something that is very different than what the world around so often thinks. Let's conclude back here in 2 Peter, or rather in 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 3. We already looked at much of what Peter said to wives, but notice in verse 7, 1 Peter 3:7. Likewise, you husbands, dwell with them, with your wives, according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel. That doesn't mean weaker in the sense of inferior. Yes, women normally have less physical strength. The word that's used here actually means more fragile, more easily broken, more sensitive. Husbands, dwell with your wives according to knowledge, giving honor, showing respect unto the wife. Recognize she's more sensitive, more easily hurt, more fragile. As being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. As being heirs together, joint heirs, joint heirs with Christ, husbands and wives, men and women, joint heirs, heirs together of the grace of God. God didn't create women as an afterthought. He didn't create them as deficient men. He didn't create them as some sort of inferior creature. God created women, along with men, to be heirs together to His kingdom. Now, there's a role in the family and in the church that a woman is to play, and that role is a little different than a man. Men and women, they really are different. God made them that way. He made them male and female. But He also made them to be heirs together of the grace of life. He made them to have that kind of love and respect for one another and to Him. There are very valuable lessons and very valuable contributions that a woman can make. There are none that are more valuable than giving her loyalty, her guidance, and her love.